Next, we have an introduction to the Gopher Tortoise Demography Working Group, Brian Noose.
Thank you, Erica. Hey, everybody. I'm just going to start talking. While you look at this pond. Yeah. So that's a very grand-sounding title. Really what I'm going to do is talk to you about an idea that some of us have been throwing around, kind of make a pitch to you about this idea, and then an appeal at the end. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brian Noose. I am a postdoc with Clint Moore at the Georgia Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Georgia. How do I do that?
I think they have to do it.
Oh. Okay. And here on the slide with me is Clint and also Laura. But there are more people than that involved that I'll mention later. So when I say this to myself, I always say "get dog," and I think it's because of the way we spell dog in Athens a lot of the time. So I'll give you some background, just sort of give a general overview of demography as a way to talk about what we're thinking, and then talk about some of our plans that we've discussed. Okay, so we held a meeting last fall at the Jones Center, some of us, with this loose title, Conservation Targets. And I'm not going to talk too much about the meeting itself, but there were two goals for the meeting. One was to determine these geographic units throughout the range that within which conservation would sort of be focused. And within those units, the task was to identify this number of viable populations that would result in stability for the species. And they needed to be represented throughout the range. So number one turned out to be really pretty straightforward for a lot of the states involved. Number two became the crux of the meeting, it turned out. Okay, so how do you establish a number of populations, thinking about smaller units, but you want to ensure stability across the whole range? Well, first you have to ask yourself, what does stability mean even? And that's pretty difficult to describe. But the idea of viability of populations or groups of populations is pretty well defined. So that's what we sort of settled on. Our group, Clint and Brian Crawford and myself, kind of proposed using a population viability model. Jeff conveniently has already mentioned this one. It's Tuberville et al., 2009. So we wanted to determine persistence probability of these groups of populations as well, individually as well as together. And so we went through this meeting, which I won't talk much about, but by the end of it, we had all these experts in the room, and they were using this model to generate consequences, and the consequences turned out to be numbers of populations that would be required. And in some of these cases, Jeff sort of pointed to one, which was Alabama in the periphery of the range. They were requiring enormous numbers of populations to meet this viability threshold that was desired. And so there was a discussion about what was in the model and what might be needed to generate something that looked more like reality in those areas. So what we got essentially was a sort of validation mixed with a sensitivity analysis of the model. And some knowledge gaps were identified and improvements were suggested. And I think many of us came away thinking that a really more airtight, up-to-date PVA would be very helpful in tortoise conservation planning, one that could be applied across the range. So, of course, all these improvements that were discussed require more study and more data. And because resolving these population vital rates is not easy. So just as an aside, so what is a PVA really? It's basically a demographic population model at heart. So we say that word a lot. What does demography really mean? I think as ecologists, we mainly think about demography being the mechanism that leads to the number of individuals that there are, that we observe. This usually involves dividing a population into groups. So we talk about sex or age or stage and different values of survival, say, for those groups. We can make predictions from a model like that that are very convenient: population growth rate, age structure, extinction risk over time. And so, you need these classic parameters like birth rate or fecundity, recruitment rates to the next life stage, stage-specific survival, immigration or emigration to a population, maybe density dependence operates. And maybe these are stable, maybe they vary over time. So the very most simple way to break up a tortoise population would be maybe hatchlings, juveniles, subadults, and adults. But then, just with those 4 bins, you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things that you need to be estimating. And really, that's probably more simple than most populations can be represented as. So more bins means more arrows that you have to measure. So it's a lot of time and effort invested, as I'm sure Jeff convinced you. And so, of course, you can make these predictions about trajectories of populations. And a key thing to consider here is that, these 2 trajectories are fit to the same simulated data, which consists of a single survey, I think, that happened here. If you add stochasticity to a model, things really change. So here's a deterministic model. All it's doing is shooting at a line, basically, from the starting point to the survey. Here, there's stochasticity, and many of these simulated populations crash. So that's an issue that comes up when you're trying to model a population. Classically, as Jeff gave a great summary of, it's if you want to figure out what these rates are in your population or abundances, so there are these G graduation and P persistence in each of those life stages, then you do a market capture study and you mark animals and you observe them through time. And then with gopher tortoises, it's a very long time. But even then, there are some issues, and movement is one that I've been sort of fixated on. We sent Alex Wright out, if you remember him. He was around for a few years. We sent him to Ichwe to look for some tortoises that were marked there in the 90s. And he went to all these little red dots here. He didn't find very many tortoises because it's pretty hard to find tortoises in this enormous area. So this is Ichwe. But he was able to sort of solve this paradox that had been nagging him, which is that the apparent survival at Green Grove, which is a very healthy population at Ichwe, seemed lower than all these other populations. And that was hard to explain. But when he put together a model that allowed movement of the tortoises, even from the few that he caught, he was able to reconcile that and show that actually true survival at Green Grove was the highest of all these populations. So just by adding a very sort of straightforward estimate of movement, he was able to get from something that didn't look very real to something that was. The point of all this is that there are problems even with a traditional market capture study, even though it's extremely intensive to do in itself. Recently, we've been playing around with some more roundabout ways to do estimation of these parameters. And one of these is, the general term for it is an integrated population model. And this is where you take different kinds of information about a population. Some of it might be your population, things you measured. Some might be taken from transferred from other populations that you know about. In this case, we're taking survey data. So we just have sort of a snapshot of the sizes of tortoises. So this is a survey done by the Georgia DNR. We combine that with other information like a growth curve that we didn't generate at this population. We took it from somewhere else. And given sort of some other vital rates that we have to make hypotheses about, we get a picture then of, conditional on those hypotheses, what the true values are of these abundances, what they could be. And so this is just saying you can't have a population where you have 20 pretty sizable adults where you have no hatchlings ever. There's got to be some, right? So that makes perfect sense. And then you can do the same thing for these other size classes. So in this way, we're sort of able to like draw a lasso closer, a snare sort of around the true values of these parameters without measuring them directly in a population. It'd be better if we could, but we do have ways to share information across sites and to use multiple pieces of information to hone in on the true values of these parameters. So given that, oh, and I should say that if you stay tuned for Heather's talk later, Heather Gaia, she's going to tell you how we can make this situation better, hopefully. Okay, so a critical question then is, if we're going to do this, if we're going to try to use parameter values and trade them across parts of the range, where is that valid and where is it not? As you move across the range, things change in terms of latitude and temperature, seasonality. You get physical habitat changes, and you get community changes, of course. And so we'd really like to know, if you change one of these things, what happens to the relevant vital rates in the population. And really, this demands some kind of strategy to do model fitting, data gathering, and model assessment throughout the range. So anyway, that was the picture sort of that came to us, I think, by the end of this meeting. We can't make decisions about conservation if we can't make predictions. It kind of comes down to that, the way we're seeing it anyway. And because we need to know how things work across this whole enormous area, we'd be best served, perhaps, by coordinating efforts to gather these estimates for these population parameters. And this meeting is a testament to the fact that there already is some coordination, but maybe we can improve that even more. Just in the sort of realm of predictive population modeling. So kind of got this idea for a working group and got support from people who agreed to serve on a steering committee here. So Ron Crawford, Jeff, Clint, Betsy, Laura, and Tracy. And so in this group, we have field researchers and also sort of like armchair ecologists. But it's important for those two groups to be communicating, I think. And we have some other people who have been very supportive of the idea who are not on this list. So our vision here, we have a few things that we'd like to do, I think, in the future. One would be to develop channels by which we can collect data and expert opinion and put together a new viability model. So we want to collect what's known now in the best way that we can manage it. Some of that information is data measured in the field, and some of it is what we call expert opinion, which is field researchers' experiences on the ground. Eventually, I think it would be very helpful to have some kind of central data warehouse, not to steal people's proprietary data and make them feel bad about that, but to really facilitate new analyses that we can't even imagine right now, and to better find the gaps in the data that exist now. And then we've talked about some way to coordinate new research that would encourage collection of demographic information. Because I think some people are in the field and they maybe don't know that they have data or collecting data that would really help a model like this. Maybe even provide some kind of field manual, and then connect past work and modeling to field efforts. We are seeking some funding to pursue these. But what I'd like to do now is appeal to you that anyone who's interested in this idea, we would love for you to follow along with this group. So if you are studying demography directly, or you're acquiring data that you suspect might inform some kind of integrated model, if you have field experiences that we could draw upon, or you're just generally supportive, I would love to hear from you. And I think I have to wrap up here, but one thing that's really important to mention is that there are data sets in file cabinets that I've heard about. If you know of any of these, I would really like to hear about them. And so we'd love for you to participate and talk to you further about this. There's some funding, and there's my email. So if this strikes you as being interesting, please email me now, or talk to me in the coming days. And thank you very much.
Thank you.